This is CRM Audio Performance Edition with Stephen Smith and Joel Lindstrom. This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And KingswaySoft now fully works with CDS and Power Apps. We thank KingswaySoft for sponsoring CRM Audio Performance Edition. Welcome to CRM Audio Performance Edition. I'm here as normal with Stephen Smith. Hi, Stephen. How you doing?
Hey, good.
And we have a guest with us, Tim Huemmer.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, Tim. So, Tim, you are an integration development superstar.
You want to call it that? Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what your background with integration is.
So, been doing a lot of integration and migration work for CRM over the past 10 years, using a variety of tools as they have evolved over time. You know, primarily working with SSIS, batch type integrations, but also kind of, you know, in more of the real-time web services type integrations as well. Worked on the platform for 10 years and seen all kinds of things, but there's new stuff that is uncovered with every project that we do.
What's different with an integration now versus maybe 6 years ago?
I would say the technology for interfacing with CRM has greatly improved. And so the APIs support a much richer methods for interfacing with the platform. So it's much easier to do more real-time interactions from non-Microsoft systems. The REST API, I think, has really opened up the doors to easier integrations with other systems.
Okay. So how has the move to the cloud changed the way that you're doing integrations?
It really has changed a lot from the batch integration perspective because a lot of people would leverage the database. And being able to have your hands on that CRM data, you could just reach in there and grab whatever you wanted to. It kind of changes your mentality of saying, okay, I've got to read stuff out of the API and figure out. The biggest challenge I see with cloud-based integrations is managing large-scale integration. So if you're talking about loading tens or hundreds of thousands of records on a nightly basis, not having that database right there to reach into presents a challenge because with that scale of data, you know, you can't just process one record at a time through the API. You have to think about your integration in a different way.
Yeah. Do you find that a lot of times when you're talking to a company, do they frequently have some misconceptions about how integration should work?
I think it's usually oversimplified in a lot of situations where, you know, you just can't you have the systems talk to each other or just trying to, you know, cram something together in the quickest time possible versus really thinking about, okay, let's spend a little bit of extra time to make this thing a little more bulletproof. And that's, I think it's the biggest misconception is just oversimplification.
Yeah, and I think that in my experience, the biggest challenge is that you have integration developers who are not used to integrating with an online system, and they write their integration as if they're on-prem. And you can get away with a lot when you're on-prem. You can write really inefficient code that maybe overqueries or does a lot of operations, very, very chatty integrations, that once you move to online, then those integrations that may only take, you know, a few minutes will end up taking hours. So that's something that I think the developers for Dynamics still are trying to kind of get up to speed on the real ramifications, especially, like you said, with these large data sets. You can't get away from the fact that the latency between an on-prem database and online is going to be dramatically higher than if you're on a local network.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think a lot of that comes back to not being able to get your hands on the database.
Yes.
You know, a lot of developers really use that as a crutch to say, I can reach in the database and I can do this.
And having to go through the API versus going straight to the database, because obviously database is going to be super fast relatively. But having to go through the API, you kind of have to get used to the fact that your operations are not going to be as fast.
Yeah.
And just dealing with that high latency, relatively high latency to CRM Online, it's just going to kill your performance unless you write efficient code.
Yes.
Right. So another thing is managing expectations. And let's go back to why most business applications customers do integrations. It's because they want Dynamics to be the front end system for their users. They don't want people to log into their ERP system or log into their their invoice system. They want to have this present all to that. But sometimes that creates some unrealistic expectations, like, oh, we can put everything, and then you start rebuilding the whole system in there, and it becomes overly complicated.
Yeah, I think so. You're right about that, Joel. I think it's hard for companies sometimes to understand where to draw the line of the I guess the cost versus benefit of, how much data do I put into CRM to give the users enough benefit, but also not making it so complicated that they may get slightly more benefit from not having to go out to, let's say, an ERP system. Maybe that covers that last 10%, but it adds so much more complexity that it's just not worth it at that point in time. You have to draw the line. It can't do everything, but you want to get enough data in there so it provides benefit, and that's probably that gray area. Getting that honed into more of a line versus a gray area is a difficult.
Look for the 75-80% rule.
Yes.
Where you got, this is what most people need. There's these edge cases where we'll find another way to accommodate those, maybe a BI report or something.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at how much data are you trying to push, right? So some customers want to push like an extremely large data set, and they literally copy it over and over again every night, as opposed to, say, only updating the changes. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that tends to cause these integrations to run longer than they really need to.
Yeah.
So what would you do, and this has happened in several meetings I've been in, where people say, we want to integrate with our ERP, but we're moving to SAP in 8 months. How do you answer that?
In that scenario, what you try to come up with is you avoid using terminology that's specific to their current ERP and say, okay, what is a common kind of business definition of something that you want to get out of the system? And you basically want to put up a buffer. You don't want to tightly couple to that one specific ERP. You want to have something in the middle there that has more generic terms: account number, account name, address 1, 2, 3. You don't want to have things that are specific to that ERP. So that way, hopefully your interface between CRM and, let's call it, this middle layer, and that ERP system 1 versus 2, you're only hopefully having to rewrite that integration between the ERP and your kind of middle tier versus having to rewrite the entire integration.
So it's a data warehouse or staging tables or something so that you can then switch out and replace with the data from the other system without having to redo your integration.
Correct. Yeah, if it's a batch integration, it's a staging area that gets populated differently. If it's real time, you want to set up maybe a web API project that has a separate set of web services there that either system could interface to, and you just kind of build a common interface that either system could consume.
If I was a developer, I would call it an interface. An abstraction layer, basically. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
That makes sense. And
right. So where do you see virtual entities today?
I think virtual entities are a great concept. I think we've struggled to find a lot of good cases where we use them extensively. I'd like to see that technology mature a little bit and some of the restrictions get lifted where, you have to have your data has to be shaped a certain way, right, and not all customers' data is shaped that way. So sometimes it's getting them over the hump to transform their data to look like or to take a shape that the virtual entities could consume takes time, and specifically, having to have a unique identifier that's a GUID. So that's a lot of systems don't have that. So then you've got to figure out, well, where am I going to assign this value that will work with the virtual entity system? And that's, it's kind of tricky to come up with that.
But the biggest mistake that I keep seeing is when people see virtual entities, they think, oh, well, I'm just going to take my CRM Online, create a virtual entity, and query an on-prem data set in real time. And people just don't understand the fact that you don't want to try to query on-prem data in your online system in real time, especially since you got to get through the firewall. You probably have to go through an application gateway, and a lot of enterprise companies, they have an application gateway. So there's just so many points of failure for that virtual entity to go through.
Yep.
And if it happens to be part of some other queries that are going on in the system, of course, that's going to take the latency hit to hop across the internet down to on-prem, and never mind the points of failure. So whenever I look at virtual entities, I kind of think of, okay, whatever the data is that I need, how do I get it from on-prem up into the cloud to at least sit in the data center next to my online system, such that I've eliminated the points of failure, but also the latency of hopping over the internet down to that on-prem system.
Right. Okay. And so then what about SSIS or batch versus things like Logic Apps or Flow or those new types of integration options we have?
That is an interesting topic to discuss. I've had some pretty good luck with using Logic Apps to do some, let's call them, not as high volume integrations. I think still one of the pieces that I really struggle with is higher volume integrations still tend to perform better using kind of a batch system. Now you can still use cloud technologies, but using more of an SSIS type approach with a KingswaySoft adapter, there's a lot of pre-processing that you can do inside of a database that's hard to replicate outside of a database. But using a Logic app to do some more lightweight integrations, creating simple interfaces to service buses to take information out of CRM, push it into another system, push it into a service bus so another system can consume it, it's great. I've done a lot of those that normally it would take me, 2 or 3 days to write code to create a listener to take something from a service bus, and I can just, in a Logic app, I can just say, listen to this topic, and then reroute it to some code, and I don't have to worry about it. And so it's great, and I think that technology continues to improve, where, we've really have solved a lot of integration issues with Logic apps.
How real time do you get with the Logic apps?
It can be... Nothing is purely real time.
It would be near real time.
Near real time.
Yes. Right, because I'm thinking back, this is years ago, we had an integration with a fairly well-known restaurant chain, and it was their catering group. Mm-hmm. And when they had somebody enter in an order, they wanted it immediately to go to Dynamics so the person that was working with somebody over the phone could do something with it. And we had a batch job that was running like every 2 minutes or something. It was crazy. Wow. Yeah. Where something like this, it would be more of a Logic app that would listen and then send it pretty much immediately, would be much more well suited for that type of scenario.
And the Logic app is really well suited for that type of situation where you've got real time data transfers between systems, where it's, orders coming in. You're not talking about getting 10,000 of these at a time. You're getting 1 or 2 here and there, and they're coming in. It will orchestrate that very well. And then what you can do is you can leverage Azure Functions to do some more heavy lifting if you need to do some transformation logic, any kind of, things that go beyond what a Logic app can do. An Azure Function is a great way to offload some of that processing power, but you can facilitate that type of integration near real time.
So is the rule of thumb like individual record transactional stuff? You consider using Logic apps where if it's a large number of data updates, more of a batch approach works better?
Well, I think the problem is, or the challenge is, that we're having to go the batch route due to the fact of legacy systems being set up to run in batch, right? So if you need some data for an operation, but it doesn't get updated until 2 a.m., you can't do anything until 2 a.m., right? And then what I've always run into is you have a set of information that you're dependent on, and they're all dependent on other pieces of information that doesn't run until 12 a.m., right? And then you get to the point where, like I had one customer, we literally had a 2-hour window that we had to get all of our updates done in CRM before the users came in.
Right.
But we were dependent on a whole host of other batch style operations that meant we could not run our stuff until I think it was like 5, right?
Right.
5 or 6. And unfortunately, that's just kind of the world that we came out of. What I like to do is I like if I can get my customers into a more real-time integration scenario, I prefer that using durable messaging. So like using Azure Service Bus, for example, because what it does is it also gives you kind of a fallback mechanism. Like if I have an integration like an SSS package and it tries to do something in CRM and CRM happens to not be there, it stops, right? Whereas if you're using durable messaging, you can continue those kind of operations. And if CRM's not there, then the message stays in the queue. And there's basically a retry mechanism. But when you're running everything batch, now you have to kind of write extra logic for the retry. But I think it's challenging to get to that place just for the fact that a lot of legacy systems just aren't made to be able to give you, for example, when a record changes, like in AS400, for example, they don't really have any oh yeah, hey, this customer changed at 4:05 a.m.
You don't have to modify that.
No, you don't have any. So you literally have to take the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then you crunch it, and then you have to figure out kind of after the fact in like a staging database what actually changed.
Well, it's very common for us to have a meeting with somebody, and then, of course, the end users want everything to be real time.
Right. Yeah.
And they think it should be real time, but then you talk to the data guy or person, doesn't have to be a guy, but talk to the data person, and they say, well, we're integrating with our legacy data warehouse, and it only updates every 6 hours.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And you can make it, the most real time we can make it is dependent on what that other system is.
Yeah. And I don't see any way around that until we get kind of the back-end systems upgraded to some kind of modern technology. Like, you've got a lot of these large enterprises still running AS400.
Right.
I expect they'll still be running AS400 in the next 10 years just because, it's a large effort to get off of those base systems that have been around for a while.
Well, the other thing you got to consider, too, is with things like logic apps, there's a cost for that based on the number of transactions you do. It's not high. It's very, very cheap, but if you had that, it could exponentially blow up, too, where an SSIS batch job, there's little incremental cost for it.
In fact, it will always be slower to try to use like a logic app that operates on a per record basis when you're doing set operations. SSS is always going to be faster. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So shout out to our sponsor, KingswaySoft.
That's right. It's awesome. So, but back to your point, Joel, of when do you really use a logic app, versus a batch type job? I think Stephen brought up a great point about, the technology does dictate that sometimes of what you're working with, but also, you can look at the scale. I've been able to deal with, items in tens of thousands of records without too much problem inside of logic apps. If you get above that amount, if you start getting into hundreds of thousands of records, you probably at least want to leverage some kind of staging area in a database to do that kind of pre-processing work. Hey, let's load it all in here. Let's let the database do some serious crunching, and then you can pull it back out of there with a logic app and send, do the updates. You can still leverage that technology, but you really want to do that large scale, computation of what changed. That's still a lot of times just better to be done in the database. Right.
So when somebody's had an integration for 5-6 years, how often should they revisit that? Because if you use KingswaySoft 4 years ago, there's a lot of performance improvements from multi-threading and things like that. There's also platform changes that have been made that you can take advantage of. So how do you recommend somebody maintain an integration going forward? How often should they revisit it and look at ways to tweak it and make it maybe more performant?
So I'll give you a good example of one that I just did for a customer. They had a integration, SSIS integration that was written 3 years ago before change tracking was really prevalent inside of the CRM platform. And their integration ran in 3 hours every night. So when we rewrote that integration to leverage change tracking and to kind of cache some of the CRM data into a database, now their integration runs in 10 minutes a night. So it went from 3 hours to 10 minutes.
It's amazing.
So that's a fairly, it's kind of an extreme example, but I'm not saying every integration will receive that kind of performance update, but I think these integrations really should be revisited every probably couple of years, because Microsoft does release a lot of updates to their platform, but there's going to be certain key ones that really impact performance. If you add a new feature to the system, well, your integration is not going to care. But if you add something like change tracking, that can definitely, you can leverage that to improve your integration.
All right. And you should also probably ask the question why periodically. Like, why are we doing this integration? What's the cost from a storage perspective of the data we're putting in here? Are we retaining too much data? Because all that stuff can slow the system down and add to your costs too. So, and almost everybody, when they design their integrations, when they first start using the system, and then you talk to them 4 or 5 years later, there's things that they decided back then that they're not really using.
Yep.
So there's probably things that they can cut out, simplify.
Are they still getting the business value from that integration?
How many times are people doing? And that's what I love about the new audit options, which were talked about on Implement This earlier on CRM Audio this week, where you can actually audit how often people are reading certain data. And you can see, is anybody really looking at this, this legacy data we're dumping in here? Is it somebody said, we have to have that because we have it in Salesforce, but nobody's really using it? Yeah. Those are the kind of things that you should periodically revisit.
Well, and I would also say revisit the strategy, the integration strategy. Why is it that the integration was built a certain way? There may have been things going on during development that necessitated a certain strategy, whereas maybe later on down the road, you come to find out, okay, well, kind of like what you were saying, the integration took 3 hours, but maybe if we do it a different way, it can be done in 10 minutes or so. Yeah. I had an integration once that a developer wrote, and it took 29 hours to run.
Wow.
And it was supposed to run every 24 hours. So obviously that was a problem. But come to find out, one of the challenges or one of the mistakes that developers will make, and I say developer because a lot of times you have developers writing these integrations. And to me, an integration person, it's a different skill set than the developer skill set. It's a different skill set in that there's other things that you have to take into account other than just being able to write some code. So anyway, I think one of the mistakes that is made a lot, especially on-prem to online, is not using a staging database. I think it's easier to create an integration where you just kind of query information in real time to the system and maybe some lookup data that you need to generate some set of results. But without that staging database, you have to go and query CRM live during your integration for information, and taking that latency challenge into account. In fact, that's what happened with this 29-hour integration, is that there were 500,000 accounts that needed to be, they needed to check to see if they needed to be updated, but by doing a live query for every single account to CRM Online, the developer had to make 500,000 queries just to see if the record needed to be updated. So that didn't even include the updates that had to happen.
So that would be an ET integration at Phones Home Too Often, right?
Yeah, I mean, but so the same integration was cut down. I think it was like 3 to 5 hours. By merely introducing a staging database. And
a staging database doesn't have to be a copy of your entire database. It can just be the main GUIDs and identifiers.
Yeah, we just needed to know, did this record change? Does it need to be updated?
So Tim, I know you do that too. You kind of flatten the query so you don't have to do a bunch of lookups into dynamics or other systems, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I sometimes call that pre-processing the data, where you take the data from the source system, you kind of transform it inside of a staging area to make it look like how it's supposed to look in CRM. And then you go and flag ahead of time. You say, here's the ones I'm going to have to create. Here's the ones I'm going to need to update. And then you can use the cool features of KingswaySoft where you can say only send changed fields up. And that, you would think that might have a detriment on performance, but it actually makes things a lot faster because you're not even though you've got an extra read for Kingsway to go look and make that comparison, it's not sending every single field back to CRM. It's only sending what changed, therefore probably reducing the possibility of extra workflows getting triggered, extra audit records getting created, all kinds of stuff. So it ends up being much faster.
So on the workflow topic, how do you, as a integration developer, how do you make sure the integration plays well with all the other potential processes and triggers and actions and business rules and workflows? And how do you recommend to your customers that they are cognizant of that potential performance hit if they start creating workflows that are then triggered by the integration?
That, I wish there was a simple answer to that question. It really does take, it takes a collaborative team effort really to understand that. And then from an integration design perspective, you have to look at those processes and say, what's the purpose of these? Some of that stuff might be better done by the integration. You know, it could be somebody just shoehorning some things in there to fix a couple fields that, you know, they didn't want to bother the integration developer to do. And that really should be incorporated as part of the integration.
Yes, that is a mistake that I've seen happen on multiple occasions where developers will actually write plugins that are actually part of an integration so that once, you know, the integration developer uses SSAS or whatever to push the data up, and then they're using a bunch of plugins to actually transform the data inside CRM. And that obviously has a much greater overhead than if you had just done that operation in the data before you even sent it to CRM.
Now, is that because you've got different people doing it and the person doing the integration
It's
doesn't know how
just
CRM works? So it's like, I'll write the data here, then you transform
It's a team. The way I look at it, it's more of a team collaboration challenge. You have different people working on different things. So you may have a developer that needs something to be a certain way. So they'll go ahead and write a plugin because, like you said, they're like, oh yeah, I don't want to have to wait for this integration guy to do this extra stuff. Or maybe there's another team that's outside of the Dynamics team that has to get that, you know, work order to do those changes, and that just adds overhead. So they'll just go ahead and say, all right, let me just write this plugin, and I don't have to worry about waiting for this other guy to do it. So that's, I think it's just a matter of coordination and collaboration of why those things happen, but they're just shortcuts.
Right. Yeah, so what are some things you do before, when you're designing an integration, before you run it for the first time to pre-check for data quality issues or field length issues, bad characters, all that stuff? Do you have certain go-to tools that you like to use?
Well, the first rule of thumb besides a tool is to not get sample data. Whenever I hear I'm getting sample data versus real data, that's always a big pitfall. As far as that's concerned, I don't have any go-to tools for that. You know, for data quality per se, you know, it really boils down to having someone that is good with data that can kind of go look at the information, pick some things out of there, and then you really do have to review it. There's a lot of automated tools that can look for certain things here and there, but it's not going to replace what someone who knows the data can actually pick out. They can look at it in 3 minutes and say, this is wrong, X, Y, and Z, here's problems. But if you don't have that person that understands the data, that's a really big challenge that I've found in some of the projects that I've worked on, is not having access to, or just not having the appropriate people on the team that understand the data, because that's super important.
And you shouldn't expect the data to get cleaner through an integration.
No,
it's not going to be any better than where you're coming from.
No, it's not.
Now, you can use tools like KingswaySoft has the data quality tools that you can use to like do fuzzy matching and clean your data up before you migrate or integrate it. But it's coming in when you integrate it. You know, you can do some stuff to combine records and things like that, but really realistically, you need to deal with your data quality before you integrate it to Dynamics.
Yes.
Well, a lot of times,
I was cringing when I hear, we'll bring it in there and then we'll clean it up.
Yeah.
I love
that one. I love that one. Yeah. So it's like a lot of times the customer will just point at, here's some tables in a SQL database, bring it into Dynamics. And when I look at the data, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's right or not.
Yeah.
The only thing I can do is assume that it's the way it's supposed to be. But then I've gotten into situations where some other group was in charge of some data, and I was told, oh yeah, go get some data from over here. But then you find out, oh well, no, that data's old, or that data, we don't use that anymore, and then we have to change it over here and then over here, and it's like, okay. And then if you get to a point where you don't know who to ask how valid the data is, because I've had that happen where, oh yeah, hey, yeah, okay, we're supposed to get this data. Oh, what? You guys want to use that data? And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what we were told to get. And he's like, oh, no, you don't want to use that. You got to talk to Bob over here. He'll tell you where to get the data from. And then you go talk to Bob, and he says the same exact thing. Oh goodness, you get to talk to Jimmy over here. And I'm like, okay, who knows where this data is and what it's supposed to look like? And it's just crazy sometimes.
That's why a lot of times we try to structure our projects. The staging database really comes in handy in that scenario because, at the end of the day, as CRM or Dynamics consultants, we can't understand a customer's data. And if we can provide a place for them to drop it off, then their team hopefully can go through those exercises like you just described, Stephen, where they're going to go look and find the data. Yeah. But then ultimately, they're going to be better at identifying their data and putting it into an area that we can consume it. And that usually works well for us from a project perspective, because then we don't get stuck in rabbit holes of understanding their data. And then the customer doesn't have to fully understand the intricacies of loading data into Dynamics. You kind of leverage the skill sets of your Dynamics team versus the customer's development team, and they complement each other in that situation.
So what about after you develop the integration or migration, for that matter of fact? How do you verify that it was correct, that everything, do you have certain methods or tools that you use for checking record counts or checking comparing field values? What are some of the common approaches you do?
That can get tricky. If you set up your staging area to mimic CRM, the structure there, then it's much easier to do that comparison on a database level. The one nice thing is if you use change tracking and pull data down from Dynamics after the fact, and your staging database looks exactly like the dynamic structure, you can write a simple query to check for differences. And if you see differences, something did make it there. You can compare record counts.
It's hard when it's a fast-moving integration because you need a point in time that matches in both places, right?
Yeah.
So will you run it for a focused period of time and then compare at that point?
Yeah, I mean, you'll always have some level of unit testing where you go and look and say, okay, here's these field values. Let me go look inside of Dynamics and make sure that those values are there. Pull up the form, look and see. So you're going to have some of that type of unit testing, and then after that point in time, then you'll want to have some business users validate the data as well. But as far as your point about fast-moving integration, you do want to take that in smaller chunks, make sure it works in more of a controlled scenario before you just turn on the switch and just let it kind of go to town and do its thing. Because that's really the only way. You have to establish some level of control in order to validate it.
Okay. Are there, when we're almost at the end of our time, but are there any other common mistakes, or maybe put a positive spin on this for the most successful integrations that you've seen? What are the things that maybe they do differently than some that aren't as successful?
Data cleanliness. I think your comment about, Joel, about trying to clean up the data after the fact.
Yes.
When my customers have taken the time to clean up the data ahead of time, when we really bring them on board with that concept, starting out with good data will help you avoid all kinds of pitfalls.
Side note, I have to tell this story. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I had a customer who said the same thing. We'll clean up the data after we go live, right? And the plan was, because there was so much data, they hired temps to come in and hand go through every single record and correct it. The problem was the temps didn't know how to use a computer.
So they introduced new problems?
Yeah. So the temps came in, like immediately half of them did not know how to use a computer, right? So they were out. The other half, apparently, so I was told after the fact, only we're talking like 20 different people, right? Only 3 of them were actually productive. Of the 20. So you got rid of 10. We had 10 left. And only 3 of them were actually productive and knew what they were doing and understood the instructions. But even then, they weren't able to get through all the data. And this was for a go live that was in a couple weeks. They were trying to cleanse the data before go live, quote unquote. And that was the biggest disaster. And it's the only time I've ever seen someone come up with the idea of using temps to clean up your data. Wow. And they didn't know the data.
Yeah.
They were probably walking down the street with a shopping cart the day before.
I mean, I think having people go through it, but it needs to be people who understand your data and are good at it.
Yeah,
I'll add one that I haven't heard you guys mention, which is they ask the question, like, what are we going to do with this data once we get it into Dynamics? So I had a customer one time who wanted to bring in like 15 million lead records from historical stuff. And their idea was we're going to use marketing lists. Well, marketing lists will bomb out after like 200,000 records.
Yeah.
And, advanced find, if you want to deal with 1 million records with advanced find, good luck. You can't chart it with anything in Dynamics. You basically got a bunch of data in there that you then couldn't do anything with in a practical way. And it slowed the system down. So that's a lesson learned there too, is don't think just dumping the data into Dynamics would do it. It would have been much better for them if it was modern day. This was half a decade ago or more. It would be much better for them to use something like a Power BI dashboard and show that data in Dynamics, but don't bring all that legacy data in that has no real value.
For sure, yeah.
Or just bring in what's relevant.
That's exactly.
Customers
don't bring every bring any order line, bring in a summary or something.
Exactly. You always have a fear of losing data, and so a lot of times people are overly ambitious with saying, well, we don't want to lose it, we don't know if we are actually going to need it, so let's just throw it in the system. Well, that's not always a good thing.
I had a customer that same exact scenario. They had a bunch of legacy leads. They didn't want to lose the leads, so they said, let's dump them all into CRM. And there was, I forgot how many millions of them. But what my suggestion at the time, which wasn't heated, was that, okay, these are all cold leads. We have no idea if they're good or not. Let's keep them outside of CRM and only import hot leads, right? They wanted to do a campaign. But I said, instead of dumping them all in CRM, let's keep them in another system, whether that's another dynamic system or having them in the database and running a market, because they want to use click dimensions. So we kind of had to have them in a CRM system. But instead of having them in the system where all the users are interacting with them, that they're not going to look through 8 million leads. I'm sorry, but they were kind of relying on the automation, the campaign automation, to determine if a lead would become hot by sending them emails. But they dumped them into the system, and it didn't perform very well. Like you said, especially with marketing lists, the performance was pretty bad. And especially with marketing lists, considering under the covers, behind the scenes, the platform, whenever you update a marketing list, a static marketing list, it does a count on the entire table.
Right.
And that count operation actually causes deadlocks. Yeah. I know that from experience, unfortunately. Right. So, and even Matt Whitman mentioned to me where the counts would actually be wrong.
Yeah.
Because of the deadlocks, because the lock would fail and it wouldn't actually count the records accurately. So you have even your counts from those static marketing lists not showing up correctly. So needless to say, dumping all your leads into the system is not a good idea.
Yeah, well, we're at the end of our time, but thank you, Tim, for joining us.
Sure thing.
Stephen, like normal.
Yes.
So it's great. So are you on any social media platforms like LinkedIn? I put your LinkedIn profile on here.
I'm not as active of a
He's
social...
too busy integrating data.
Right, I'm integrating
too busy. Heads down with the hoodie on, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So my social presence is
all right, we'll put your LinkedIn profile